Shall we pray? May the words of my mouth and the thoughts of all of our hearts be always acceptable to you, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I asked you before, in fact, we asked you a couple of times, what would you have done if you had been one of those two disciples that Jesus asked to go get the donkey? Would you have been wholeheartedly, enthusiastically supportive? Or would you have been like the one character in our play with maybe a little bit of skepticism? How would you have responded? To be honest, I think I would have been the skeptic. I would have wanted more information, more details. So exactly who should I ask for these donkeys? Has there been some kind of prearrangement? Or am I going to get into trouble? Why would somebody just give me a donkey because I said somebody else said they needed it? And why would he need it? We've been walking and walking. We walked all the way from Galilee down to Jerusalem, well, to Bethany, coming to Jerusalem. Why does he need a donkey for the last couple of kilometers of the trip? Wouldn't have made any sense. It would have been hard to have trusted to do what Jesus asked. As it said in the skit, you have trust issues. My suspicion is that most of us, when it comes to our faith in God, have trust issues. What does it really mean to trust God? I think for some people, trusting God means trying to make God happy with me so that I will get what I want. Where everything will always work out the way I want it to work out. But maybe there's a different kind of trust. I'll get to that one in a minute, but let's talk about the first one. Some people of faith, people who believe in God, people who are Christian, people who follow Jesus and go to church, have come to think that their faith will protect them from all the bad stuff in life. From suffering, from hardship, from illness. That if you have enough faith, you'll always be happy and healthy and prosperous. Now, those who aren't happy and healthy and prosperous, well, obviously, they don't have enough faith. And maybe they did something wrong to deserve this suffering that's happened to them. There are even some churches that preach what's called prosperity religion. That is, that if you have enough faith, you'll be rich financially. That's an example of how you are blessed. It kind of is like the Protestant work ethic from long ago, that if we work hard and if we're pleasing God, then we'll be prosperous. When I was in Nicaragua one time, a few years ago, we were at this huge church where it was the youth service, hundreds of young people there. And I don't know Spanish well enough to really follow the sermon, and so we had somebody who was translating. And there was one part that really caught my attention. The preacher said to these young teenagers, most of whom were not very wealthy at all, he said, "You may be cleaning somebody's toilets now, but if you have faith in Jesus, someday somebody will be cleaning your toilets." I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and yet I know that deep down, a lot of people have that sense that maybe, just maybe, if I have enough faith, enough trust, things will work out well for me. Maybe better than other people. Maybe I'll deserve it more. And to be completely honest, there are some passages in the Bible that would lead you with that impression. I remember when I was studying Old Testament and Hebrew at Queen's Theological College, our professor His name was Hal Parker. And he used to often refer to passages that he said reflected what he called the twofold path. Obey God, that's the one path, and everything will go well. Or don't obey God, the second path, and things won't go so well. And so there certainly are some scriptures that people can draw upon to leave them with this impression that if they have enough faith, everything will go their way. That trust is about getting what we want, when we want it, how we want it. But for me, that doesn't seem to be what is reflected in the last week of Jesus' life. It's interesting that in the Gospels pay a lot of attention to the last week of Jesus' life. Anything from 20% to almost 50% of the Gospels is about that last 7 days. What he did in the other 3 years of his ministry and even before is the rest. But a lot of the Gospels focus on this last week. It starts with the triumphant entry into Jerusalem on what we have come to call Palm Sunday. People were coming for the annual festival of the Passover. And so there were crowds and crowds coming. They weren't there just for Jesus, but when they heard that Jesus was coming, it seemed that a lot of people wanted to get caught up in that excitement. And then Jesus spent time teaching in the temple. And then on Maundy Thursday, what we have come to call Maundy Thursday, he shared the Seder Passover meal with his disciples in what we now call the Last Supper. And so the first part of the week went pretty well. There was the Palm Sunday celebration, there was teaching in the temple, there was this great feast. But then things took a very different turn. Because on that same Thursday, after the meal, is when Jesus was arrested. He was praying in a garden when he was arrested. And he was taken and he was put in a cell overnight. And the next day he was tried and sentenced and crucified and died on that Friday. And then there was the Saturday, that in-between time, that not knowing time, that time of fear and grief and uncertainty among his followers. What had just happened? The week didn't turn out the way they thought it was going to. And just as they were trying to come to grips with all that had happened and why Jesus had suffered and died, Easter Sunday came along and they experienced Christ's living presence among them again. And so it's clear that Jesus, no matter how close he was to God, didn't avoid suffering and, yes, even death. And those who follow Jesus shouldn't expect that they either will avoid all suffering or even death. In fact, Jesus told his followers, "Take up your cross and follow me." That doesn't sound like that prosperity religion stuff to me. That doesn't sound like you're going to get everything you want in life if you follow me. It sounds like if you follow me, you don't know where it's going to lead. It won't always be an easy journey. So why would anyone choose to follow someone who says, "Come and follow me and you'll suffer"? In fact, the disciples challenged Jesus when he said it. Don't say that. Who's going to follow you if you say that? They want to follow you because they're going to hear everything is going to turn out great. Better than you'd ever expected. So why would Jesus say it? Why would he say, "Follow me, and this is what might happen to you"? I think he said it because he knew that's the reality of what it is to be human. That our lives are not this straight line trajectory of everything getting better and better and better all the time. Our lives have ups and downs. Our lives are a continual cycle of those ups and downs. And especially when we love, I mean really love, that can put us in very vulnerable situations. So this cycle of life is a cycle of times of happiness and joy, times like the Palm Sundays of life and the Seder suppers of life, where we celebrate life and we celebrate being a part of a community of faith. But then all of our lives go through times of hardship and suffering. Even times when we feel abandoned, as Jesus did, and say, God, why have you forsaken me? And all of our lives face the reality of death, our own or the deaths of loved ones. And then the incredible uncertainty and emotions that go along with the grief in our lives. But even though there are those times of hardship and suffering, and yes, even death and grief, there are those times of hope and new strength and new life that gives us the ability to go on. So what helps us to get through this cycle of life, these high points and low points, and to keep going in spite of the low points? Well, I'd like to quote one of the great theologians of our time on this point, Elton John. You may remember that movie, The Lion King, and the song that he wrote for that movie called The Circle of Life. And here's a portion of what that song says. It's the circle of life, and it moves us all through despair and hope, through faith and love, till we find our place on the path unwinding in the circle of life. We're all on that circle, that unwinding circle of despair and hope, of struggle and of blessing, of challenge and of joy. And in that song it says, what helps us get through is faith and love. Faith, not that everything's going to work out the way we want, but faith that we are a part of something bigger than ourselves. To trust that we are surrounded and enveloped and embraced by love beyond ourselves. To quote another theologian, a real one this time, American theologian William Sloane Coffin says, God offers minimum protection but maximum support. So having faith isn't about being protected from all the bad stuff of life. It's feeling that we are not alone in it. That we are a part of something greater than ourselves. That we have a companion along the path. In the New Creed of the United Church, it says, we are not alone. God is with us. Thanks be to God. In life, in death, in life beyond death, we are not alone. And not only can we have that faith that God is a companion along the way, but the other part of those two words, faith and love, is a reminder that we can be companions with one another. And even in those times when we may feel forsaken by God, that we can still be a companion to one another, that they can still feel that they are loved by us, and that they are important and special even in their time of challenge and hardship. When we are a part of a community of faith and love, then we can both find strength from each other and also offer our support and encouragement to each other as we're all on this unwinding path of the cycle of life. A number of years ago, I went to a workshop on preaching sermons. I know you can't tell, but I did actually go to a workshop. I've been on a few, but this one in particular, the person who was leading the workshop said that every sermon should reflect this cycle of the last week of Jesus' life. that every sermon should talk about life and the celebration of life, and the high points and the joys of life, but also to recognize the struggles and the hardships and the suffering. And yes, even the death and the endings in our lives. Maybe not the literal deaths, but those things that end that we might have wished hadn't. And yet in the midst of that, the new life and the fresh starts that can emerge that we might not have seen before. Now, I'm not saying that every sermon I've ever preached does follow that pattern, but I do think about it often. Because that is that cycle of life that we're all on. The cycle of life that Jesus recognized and embodied in that last week of his life. We call this Sunday Palm Sunday. But it's also in the liturgical calendar called Passion Sunday. Passion meaning the suffering that Jesus endured in the coming week. And so on this Sunday, we hold those two things in tension. The joy of being a part of this crowd that accompanied Jesus in this joyful celebration, but also knowing that it would lead to a time of hardship and suffering and even death. But that would not be the end of the story. That Easter would follow, that the followers of Jesus would have a sense of Christ's living presence among them, giving them the strength to go on. So I'm going to ask you again. What would you have done if you had been asked to go get the donkey? Would you have been able to have that sense of trust and love? Would you have been able to sense that in spite of the apprehension, in spite of the possible hardships or consequences, that you would do what Jesus asked? You know, I don't think any of us is ever going to be asked to go get a donkey. But Jesus does ask us to do some things that maybe even be harder. To love our neighbor. To reach out to those who are in suffering and need. To walk that path, not just in the joys of life, but also in the struggles and the hardships. That's probably a more important question for us to ask ourselves. Are we willing to answer that request of Jesus? To follow in his way of love. To be able to reach out to those who are facing times of challenge and hardship. And so on this Palm Sunday, this Passion Sunday, as we are at the beginning of this week, recognizing the joys and the suffering, recognizing the life and the death and the new life again, may we be open to God's love and God's presence. May that be the source of our faith and trust that we are not alone. That God cares for us, and that we are called to care for one another, so that we can celebrate with each other the blessings of life, and walk with each other on the paths of the hardships of life, and together experience that new life of Christ's presence and love among us, giving us hope now, and hope in whatever lies ahead. Thanks be to God. Amen. The next hymn that we're going to sing is number 614. And it's a hymn that was written by a United Church minister named Rob Johns. And the story goes that it was a part of a hymn writing competition. And his wife at the time was receiving treatment for cancer. And he wrote this song as an expression of that fact that even in her time of suffering, she could sense love and compassion from him and from God. Now, his wife actually recovered. But not long after writing this hymn, Reverend Rob Johns himself died. And so it's a reflection of that fact that even though he was seeking to bring hope and comfort to his wife in one way, it actually brought hope and comfort in another way. And may it bring hope and comfort and strength for us as we sing it in suffering love.